This morning I talked a fair bit about why we would want to consider things like cover crops, no-till, wild soil health is important, why we should care, why the next generations should care. And what I want to do is put some more application to that now this afternoon, and the best way that I know how to do that is to share through the examples of operations that are actually doing this. And try and share some of their reasons for doing it, share through some of the process of selection, use, termination, economics, all of those things that get tied into making cover crops work. And again, like was said this morning, cover crops are just a tool, although I believe they're a multifaceted tool that you can accomplish numerous objectives at the same time. But they're not the end-all be-all, just like no-till is not the end-all be-all. And I think through some of these slides and some of this information, hopefully I can convey how they're pieces to the puzzle and how everybody's puzzle is going to be a little bit different. And these are going to be examples from in North Dakota. However, the principles, the concepts are very similar in my mind. And I've seen those regardless where I've gone in the country or even on up in Canada. And so I want you to take those. You might have to apply some of your own numbers. You might have to look at tweaking the system some in order to make these work in your situation. And don't be afraid to do that. But I want to challenge you to do one thing. As you watch this, as you look at or listen to any presentations today or any future workshops, try and keep the attitude of how can I make that work rather than finding ways that it's not going to work. Okay? Agricultural people are some of the most stubbornly innovative people that I know. And if there is any group in this world that can figure out how to make something work, it's going to be the people in this industry. But the first thing it starts with is saying, I can figure this out. I don't have the answer now, but I'm going to figure it out. And then they proceed. And what holds people back is when they don't even allow themselves to enter that realm to start with. So, here we're going to talk about managing cover crops, specifically this tool to enhance soil health. Just a little background, Burleigh County, you can see where that's drawn out there. Burleigh County is kind of right in the central part of North Dakota. It's about, like I said earlier, about 1 million acres in size, the county is. Our cropland constitutes about 50% of it, the other 50% in general. And of course, you have urban areas and some other things, but is pasture ground and hay ground, all constituting towards livestock operations. Our annual moisture, and it's off to the side here a little bit, but what's circled on the right-hand side here is, I believe it's 16.2 inches. That's annual moisture for the year. Now, of course, I don't know what everybody defines as normal, okay, because average is basically the average of a bunch of abnormal years, because nothing generally falls right on target. But that's where we kind of figure we use that to help us gauge how much moisture reserve we might have, how much time we have for catch-up. Generally, our moisture that we can really count on in most years, not all years, but most years, comes in the spring. Okay, starts in April, but May and June are our big months for moisture. We can generally count on that. And what's happened is our timing of our cover crop planting has been a function of moisture. Okay, it's pretty common in our environment. About 4th of July, 10th of July, the faucet turns off. And from what I've heard from some people here, it's similar in some areas around here that can happen. With that being the case, sometimes it's been a little hit or miss with some cover crops later in the season, July, August, that type of area. But what we have found is on soils that are really, really functional, high in terms of soil health, it's less and less of an issue to get things started, requires less and less moisture, and we have a much better chance. Of course, some of this 16.2 inches comes from snow most years, about 40 to 42 inches of snow per year. And of course, that's not all equated to pure moisture, but that's kind of our average in our area. I talked about the principles being fairly universal. And if you've ever listened to Gabe Brown or Jay Fear or Ken Miller or any of those that I have the opportunity to work with, they would tell you the same thing. And they would tell you the two real important things that we can have some influence on in terms of creating the environment for our free workers, so soil microbes below the soil surface to work for us. They need a home and they need a food source. Okay, real similar to what we need. Now you can throw water and oxygen and other things in there, but creating this home and this food source is something through our management that we can have a pretty strong influence over. The other thing that we tend to do, and this is kind of the foundation in which we start, is we try to look at a healthy native ecosystem in that area. Wherever I go in the country, and it's not always easy to find necessarily, but I try and go and view and take a look at an area like that. And of course in central North Dakota, we're looking at how the midgrass prairie ecosystem function, and we use that as some indicators as to what we can follow in our decision making for our cropping. And some specific things we look at when I get to take that walk out in the pasture or out in the crop field, we're looking at how the water cycle is functioning, how the mineral or nutrient cycle is functioning, how is the diversity, to what levels and what types of plants, and are they cool seasons, are they warm seasons, is it a combination of both? In energy flow, one of the few things that is arguably the free lunch that we can get in agriculture is solar energy. Be careful where I stand here. Now, it's often said there are no free lunches, and maybe there aren't, but there's some that come at a pretty discounted price. If we can collect more and more and more solar energy, that's more and more wealth and value that we're going to get. Anytime that we have solar energy available for growth or for capture and we are not capturing it, we're leaving something on the table. Okay? This is why in our native ecosystem, the diverse native prairie, made up of cool seasons and warm seasons, grasses, broadleafs, and shrubs, and some trees, not a whole lot, but some. Any given day that conditions are such that something can grow, there is something filling that void. And what does that do for soil biology? It's always taking that stream, that constant stream of solar energy through the plants, into the roots, into the soil, and is making that, and it's not even cycling, okay? It's a one-way street. We don't necessarily have to give anything back to the sun for that to work. But the thing is, the more we can capture, the more and bigger our solar panels are, the better we can be. This is why one thing in North Dakota, a common rotation, if you even want to call it that, years and years ago was spring wheat and fallow. And then spring wheat, and then fallow, and then spring wheat, and then fallow. Maybe flax once in a while. For wheat, that soil got a diet of one thing for part of one season. What did it get for a diet the next season? Nothing. It wasn't fed anything. You say, well, we saved that so we capture more moisture. But we killed it during all that time, and we know what effect that has on moisture, negative effect. And did they get more boost the following year with the wheat crop? Every other year? Yeah, they did. But we just talked about mineralization. We just talked about the escape of carbon dioxide. We need to understand what parts are playing a role in all of that. But the point is that now we proceed with having a continuous root in the soil at all times, absolutely possible. Now it takes some coordination when you're in a cropping scenario because there's the seeding and harvesting and all of those things, but we can do it. Now in this particular picture, the one thing that I just wanted to point out is that everything is, for the most part, is cyclical, and anytime we manage for any one thing, it's hard to maintain that particular balance, and we'll see that play out with these different species. Now speaking of the water cycle, this particular operation, and it's Brown's Ranch, so those of you that know Gabe and his wife Shelley and their son Paul, back in June of 2009, they got this moisture event in that amount of time, so a little over 12 inches in about 5.5 hours. And I had asked Gabe, I said, well, how did you know exactly that was happening? He said, well, it's as close as I could measure it, but he said it's because I had to dump out my rain gauge twice. And he said you could literally almost watch it fill up. And I said, well, you timed it, you saw it in the rain gauge. I said, more importantly, what did that do to your landscape? And he said, well, I was pretty worried about it. So he said during the night, even though I put on my rain gear and go out, he's like, I wanted to know how the soils reacted in this type of intense event. And I said, so do you have any idea how much moisture went into the soil before it started to run? And he said, visual estimate, walking his crop fields, the first 8 to 8.5 inches went straight into the ground. And I said, wow. I said, that's really impressive. He said, no, Josh. He said, I've got a lot more work to do because I got 12 inches. And I didn't put it all in the soil. So he said, soil health still needs improving on my place. And I said, well, you can pat yourself on the back a little bit. But the point is that's the direction, that's the attitude they take. I think they got about 13.5 inches total in that 24-hour period. And maybe you get intense rains like that here more often, but we're seeing more and more of that. Whether that's going to be a continuing trend or not, I don't know. But he got a whole year's worth of moisture almost in one rainfall event in June. So it becomes really important then that not only did that water not run off like we saw up here, it's also important that it went into the profile. And then what? We need to hang on to it, right? As much as we can. And what hangs on to that water? Having that pore space, having that organic matter, having that sponge that creates our bucket, as Jay Farrell talked about it, the more organic matter you build, the bigger your bucket gets, the more moisture that you can hold. Okay, the mineral cycle. And of course this one probably has something on it that a lot of you are not wildly crazy about. Maybe you're indifferent. But there's a real critical role that what we do above ground that can help facilitate the process below ground. And if we take this out and we either don't replace it with anything or replace it with something that doesn't provide the same benefits and the same processes, and to tell you the truth, I don't think there's anything that will completely mimic a four-legged herbivore from a mechanical standpoint. At least we haven't come up with that yet. There's some things that we miss out on that nutrient cycle. Okay, this is one of the reasons that as I get into a couple of these operations, why they've been able to take their cropping system up another notch and another notch and another notch. Okay, the first one came when they went to zero-till or no-till. The next one came is when they diversified their cropping types. So they put all 4 crop types into their crop rotation. The next step came when they started putting cover crops into their rotation and further intensifying the nutrition in the fuel that they're providing the soil. The next step came, and this was a big one, is when they incorporated the animals back into the system. And you might say, I don't have animals, I don't want animals. We have quite a few partnerships happening up there with operators that have the same opinion, and there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe that's not your passion, maybe that's not your talent, maybe that's not in the works from a financial standpoint, but it might be for someone else. And this is where the whole partnership and the whole holism that you can achieve through a community type approach can happen. Now, I just mentioned this, diversity in the cropping system with 4 crop types, a big step in feeding soil biology. And of course the last one, putting the sun to work. And this was actually kind of a joke at one of the holistic management classes I taught, because sitting at that same table when they put this objective down, their son was also sitting there. Okay? So it was kind of a dual purpose statement from their standpoint, but this is where we talk about collecting solar energy. Okay? Doing something a little bit more than the wheat fallow rotation that we used to have, because there was only just a little stream of energy that was getting put to that ground. Now, whenever we go through the process of trying to improve soil health in general, these here it's the methodology that we follow. And I'm not saying this is the only one. I'm not saying there can't be additional steps, or that it doesn't need to be tweaked by any means. But this is just a real kind of foundational process that we go through when we try and decide. For example, someone comes in and they say, well, I want to do cover crops. Okay, first question, why do you want to do cover crops? Well, I hear they're good. Okay, good for what? What are you trying to achieve? Some will come in and say, well, I just need extra livestock feed. Okay, that's a fine objective. Others say I need to work on this, or I need to work on that. Some say I need more cover. Some say I need to work on infiltration. Some say, I just heard it reduces my fertility bill. Well, you got to be careful. Okay, can it do that in time? Yes, that's possible if that's one of the objectives that you work towards. But you can't just throw in any random mix and expect that it's just going to be a cure-all. No, it's a tool. Okay, and we all know that tools can help us accomplish things, but they don't necessarily cure things. The other thing that I want to point out is when you manage towards soil health, the way that you really make progress, and no pun intended, but when you get to the root cause of the actual problems and address those, you have to be real careful not to go chasing symptoms everywhere. Because you can chase symptoms this week, next week, this season, and what do you get to do next year? You chase the same things over again. Okay? So addressing the root cause of the problem, and sometimes cover crops can do that. Maybe that's the appropriate tool, or in combination with some other things. But we have to be real careful that we're not letting the tail wag the dog, and that we get to the root cause of the problem and that we can address it. Now, I'm just going to list these here because I'll go into them a little more in depth. The first one, soil armor. And the reason we call it armor is because I want it to be emphasized just how important that part is. We can call it soil cover. Lo and behold, someone else will call it residue or call it thatch. Someone else will come by and say, well, I'm just going to call it trash. And then have we not devalued a real important part of how all of this can work? The second one, diversity. We talked this morning just a little bit about how diversity changes all the rules. Okay, we've been taught that competition, we don't want any competition for what we want to grow. Well then how on earth, when you put 10 and 12 and 15 different species together, that it makes a crop, and when you put just one species by itself, it has a more difficult time. We see diversity everywhere. Okay, the idea that monocultures don't exist in nature is something I've heard often, and I tend to agree with that statement. Continue a live plant roots. We talked about the constant diet, okay, for soil organisms. Appropriate disturbance. In most cases, that's very limited disturbance, but there might be some surface disturbance, and then a lot of times we can put the animals to work for us in that case. The other one, adequate recovery time. Anybody here manage any pastures? Okay, what is recovery time, or why is that important? You graze the plants, and then you want to give it some recovery time in order for those plants to reestablish roots, to grow back to where it was before, so that you can sustainably graze through each season, through each year. You think there's a recovery time of more? Consider the whole ecosystem. Is there recovery of more than just the plants? What else might need recovery?
The plants you don't like.
The plants you don't like?
That was the main reason for restricted grazing. The cows would eat the best part and the weeds keep growing. You had to get them raised off first too.
Okay. What else is in that ecosystem though besides the plants? Soil biology, the structure itself. Anybody here, and this is going to be controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway, anybody here that compaction is a function of time? Okay, let's think about that for a minute. And I'm talking specifically from a livestock standpoint. Okay? But the point is that adequate recovery time is something that I think we need to consider. It's long been considered in a rangeland or grassland or grazing situation. I think it's something we need to pay attention to from a cropping standpoint. And of course, the reason we do all of these things is to get something out of it, right? And this is actually something that my supervisor, Jay Fear, added here just a while back, and it says, take your reward, please. And I'll point out some of that too. Okay, here's a cover crop cocktail that was seeded on August 2nd. This is a few years ago. This is Ken Miller at his place, and he deals with some pretty harsh soils. That's why a lot of his cropland has ended up going back to a perennial grass and legume mix. But this is some of it that he's cropped for a number of years. The temperature that day was well over 100 degrees. Soil temperature was quite a ways from that though. Okay, with that soil cover, even though it was dry, even though you could dig underneath the soil and it was still like powder, and Ken works out a deal with his neighbor that he has his neighbor come over and seed his cover crops. And of course, in the beginning of August, from a time standpoint, that works pretty good. And he said, can you come over and seed my cover crop? And his neighbor said, you're crazy. It's over 100 degrees, it's windy, and we haven't had rain for a month. He said, please come over and seed my cover crop. First of all, because I'm asking you. Second of all, because Ken had a broken leg at the time, so he could technically do it. His neighbor came over, seeded half of it, and went home, and he said, Ken, I'm not going to waste your time. Ken, broken leg and all, went over, got the tractor, got the drill, and finished seeding it himself. Why? Because cover, and I hear Ken talk about and harp on cover more than anybody I've ever, I've even asked him, I said, maybe you want to lay off the cover thing just a little bit once in a while? And he said, absolutely not. He said, nothing else works without it. And of course, when he's got proof like this, 2 months later, it's hard to argue it. He's to the point, and he's not the only one, but they're to the point, some of these producers, that they feel that if you can get your soil health up to a high enough level, that it actually will only take cover on the soil and dew rather than an actual rainfall event to get some things to germinate. Now that's a ways down the road. They're not there yet, but they've got their sights set on some things that we wouldn't have even considered just a few years ago. By the way, those are his neighbor's cows that he had put that cover crop mix in for. He was pretty interested about 2 months later. And they're good friends and good working relationship. His neighbor now does cover crops himself because it works out really well for us in the fall, for weaning calves onto, and in the winter for cows, for grazing, that sort of thing. So when you look at this from a holistic planning standpoint, you know, with grazing, it's getting the animals to the right place at the right time for the right reasons. It's not a lot much different with cropping. It's just getting the animals and the seeds. And animals, I'm not talking about just the above ground critters. Okay? If you're a cash cropper and you don't own a cow or a sheep or anything like that, you still have livestock in my mind. It's just that your herd is below ground. And what are you doing to supply it nutrition, house it, take care of it, and allow it to work for you? Another example then, as we move out of the armor part of it and into diversity, this is oilseed radish. This is a 2006. To this point here, our growing season, we had about 1.5 inches of rain. So we're in a pretty bad drought. Okay? And most of the time, or when we first started, this was our first year utilizing cover crops. And the reason that we even seeded it into a monoculture is, first of all, we didn't know any better. Second of all, we'd never raised radish before, so we didn't even know what it looked like, other than pictures we had seen. So we put everything in a monoculture just so we could watch and observe what it looked like at each stage. If you can read this down here, it says 107.4. That's soil temperature. In 107 degrees, how well do you function? Okay, what would you prefer that to be? 67, 77. If you're my wife, she would say 107. Now, she's a little bit crazy that way, but the thing is, this oilseed radish has pretty much waved the white flag, hasn't it? I mean, there's not much here. It's not doing anything. Is this a crop that you can harvest? There's just nothing there. All right? Now, about 100 to 150 feet away, same soil type, same amount of moisture, same conditions, same management, use no-till, everything is the same except for one thing. It was 7 species instead of 1 species. And we got close to 7,000 pounds dry matter production with the mix. Now this was the first aha moment for us. And the aha moment should have been obvious based on us always wanting to look at native prairie in our area as an indicator of what we should be able to do and what rules we maybe should follow. Because there's all kinds of diversity out there. This right here in the middle, it's about 4 to 4.5 feet tall. It's ready to flower. That is the same oilseed radish, not the same plant, but the same species, just in the mix. This down here, although it's not 67 or 77, it is 87. Much more conducive to making it work. And of course, we can talk about those soil temperatures, and as it increases, even just at 100 degrees, which one of those was under, one of those was above, only 15% of the moisture is used for growth. This is data and research done out of Texas from actually a lot of years ago. But once you start getting higher and higher and higher, not only does your moisture efficiency go down, we actually start to kill some of that biology that's in the soil because it is so hot. Now, I don't know about you, but I really don't want to lose my labor force. And that labor force becomes ultimately important. As we move to higher and higher production levels, and I had a couple good conversations over lunch, and I'm always trying to get a better handle on what you deal with in your local area. But as anywhere in the country, as you increase production levels, you're going to get to a point where there's going to be a weakest link. And most of the time we think, well, it's just not enough nitrogen or not enough phosphorus or not enough this or moisture is the limiting factor. I don't think any of those are limiting factors now or the ones that are going to be the limiting factors in the future. I believe that it's the health and the functionality of that soil in the first place. And it's going to limit us. And more importantly, it's going to limit the following generations. But unless we start doing some things now to correct this or to get it moving in the right direction, we may think that we're doing just a bang-up job, but I think we're falling short. And I think we need to continue to push forward with soil health so that we can make sure that this doesn't become the limiting factor. Here's just a list of some of the different cover crops, different species that we've used. Some producers raise most of these crops in any given year, not as cash crops. Some of them as cash crops, but others mostly as cover crops. But cool season grasses, and broadleafs, the warm season broadleafs, and of course grasses. And when we design these mixes, we're always trying to utilize the cover crop to inject the things that we can't normally do with our annual crop. Because that's our opportunity to inject some of those nutrients or some of that nutrition that doesn't normally get fed to our crops long term. Now, you can go into, this is it's an NRCS publication. It's a soil biology primer. It's actually a pretty good publication. And you can go on the internet, you can read all this, so you don't need to actually purchase it or anything. But it's the below ground players in this soil health. And we could spend a lot of time talking about bacteria and fungal components and nematodes and protozoa and on up the line all the way to earthworms. How many here see earthworms in their soil? Okay. Why do we notice the earthworms? They're big enough so we can see them. Okay, so it's one of the first things. How many here see, can you tell what that is right there? It's a dung beetle. How many have dung beetles? Okay, granted you might have to have some livestock and that would be your first target to go and find some of those things. Okay, but there's different species in all of these that play significant roles. And it's these ones that we can't see, the bacteria, the fungal component, some of those, we can't see them, we tend to not give them a lot of credit or pay a lot of attention, but they're really, really important. How many here have ever put together a ration for any type of livestock species? Even if it was in college, okay? What is this here? It's a forage chain. What are we trying to accomplish? We might have to take a break sooner rather than later. What are we trying to accomplish?
Year-round grazing.
We're trying to accomplish a year-round food source, right? And year-round grazing would be great. Down here at the bottom, I've got diverse native perennial based on pastures and forests and that sort of thing. We generally don't make it a full year where we're at. There's lots of environments where I think you can. But the point is that we have January to December, all the way across the board, we have it covered with something, some sort of feed stuff. And if we have overlap, that just gives us more flexibility and insurance. It's the gaps that we're trying to stay away from. This is your above ground organisms, right? Do you ever put one of these together for below ground organisms? Do you ever even think about that part of it? I know I did for a lot of years. Now you might say, well, up in North Dakota, don't you freeze up for 10 and a half months out of the year? No, it's not quite that long. But I still think there's some biological activity happening at some level in the soil profile the entire year. But I guarantee you it's going to suffer if there's not any cover to it, if there's not any roots to feed on, if there's not anything to support those populations in the first place. That's the whole point of this. And if you can see between these two, is there much difference? See this one here, I just have corn for grazing. Here's just warm season broadleaf, which is just the category that it's in. So it's really not like they're all that picky. But if we've got these different categories covered, then we're supplying them all of those needs. And as you supply more and more food and more diverse food, guess what it attracts? More and more biology. So many of the pest issues that we have, in my opinion, have to do with imbalances, either above the soil or below the soil. But if we create the environment that brings these different predator species and all different types of insects, then all of a sudden we have a balancing effect that can start to take place. And then all of a sudden so many of the battles that we fight year in and year out start getting taken care of for us. Because other insects will keep other insects in check. And feeding this balanced diet with a constant stream of solar energy, solar organisms are just like animals. Okay, they require that balanced diet if they're going to achieve high levels of performance. And I'd say, Josh, this is all fine and good, but what does this really do for my operation? Money. If you want to make more money, you want to produce more, this is where I think the future's at. And it's at a lower risk, and it's more resilient than where we currently are. No matter whether we're in Indiana or North Dakota or the West Coast or East Coast, the principles follow that same trajectory. Now, think about this, for instance, with microorganisms. Do you think they work any harder than they have to? Do we work any harder? Now, I'm not saying we don't work hard, because I think agricultural people are some of the hardest working in the world. But if there's no point to working that extra hour that day, are we going to do that? In general, and maybe egg population is not the one to use as an example, in general, are people going to work extra? Not necessarily. Organisms aren't that much different. Take, for instance, today, when you came to this workshop, you found your seat, and I'm going to bring you your materials, okay? I'm going to bring you your beverage. I'm going to give you your coffee. I'm going to bring you your donuts. I'm going to bring you your lunch. Do you have any reason to get up? Might depend on how much coffee I give you. I'll give you that. But do you have any incentive to do more? Not necessarily. Now, some of us might do it on our own accord. But the point is that if we continue to supply everything, or even oversupply everything that we think that plant or that crop species might need, what role is the organism going to play? They're going to take a step back. They're not going to step up to the plate because they don't have to. Everything is happening. But the thing that's happened with some of these operations, like the Browns, like the Millers, and many others across the country, is that as they have started to back off just little bits by little bits, guess what's happened with the soil biology? It's taken a step up and another step up until some of these operations are almost completely removed from being reliant on outside synthetic fertility. Now, I'm not saying that you should jump in and all of a sudden start getting rid of fertilizer. I'm not saying that when you move into a no-till system, a lot of these guys will tell you might actually have to increase a little bit based on now having more tied up with carbon, now that you're leaving residue and roots in the soil and those sorts of things. But we got to keep in mind the role that these organisms can play and how important it can be to your profitability and your resiliency on your landscape. One of the things that we've started to include in our cover crops in more recent years is pollinators. Why would we want pollinators? Pollinating type species, okay? For more insects to come to that environment, to come to that habitat, to perform the duties that they've always performed. If we just have one crop, and don't get me wrong, some crops are pollinators themselves, but if we just have one monoculture crop all the time, there's certain insects that are never going to be a part of that environment. And a lot of times you're losing out on a lot of beneficials that could be a part of that environment. This predator-prey relationship. When I first started exploring holistic management, predator-prey relationship for me, for the most part, meant looking at things in Africa where you had the big cats chasing after the water buffalo. Okay, you saw it on Discovery Channel, you saw it in National Geographic. It was the big predator-prey thing, right? And then we start talking about how we can use that type of relationship with our grazing management. and how the same type of thing with the big herds of bison and elk and those sorts of things, how we can try and mimic those in a lot of ways with livestock. But you see, the predator-prey relationship exists at all different energy levels, including cropland. When you see a ladybug, you look at that and say, ooh, tough predator. Oh, beast, nasty beast. I probably still don't take quite that attitude with it, but it's pretty important from a predator standpoint in a cropping scenario. This is why some places we can actually inject corn rootworm into corn crops on purpose and not have any significant damage. But the other part of the equation is you have to go and you have to collect all the other species in there and find out that it's loaded with predator species that keeps everything else in check. So the point with any of the tools that we use, including cover crops, including grazing, including technology, any of those things, always keep peeling back the layers and get to the root cause of the problem and find out what the actual cause of the problem is. And sometimes you can fix it once and for all. Sometimes not. Sometimes it's more of a challenge to find out what that problem is. But don't just chase symptoms, because that's not necessarily going to advance you as far as you'd like to go. Here's a picture, and this is a pasture. It's not cropland. What's all over out there in that grassland? I know it's hard to see, so I apologize, but what does that look like? Spider webs. Exactly. Is that good or bad?
Yes,
Good. Why is that good? What does that signify? That there's spiders there. And spiders are what? Predator. And for a predator to want to be there, what does that mean? There has to be food there. There has to be prey. So now all of a sudden we're starting to build this complex web of insects, of organisms, of things that contribute. And we don't always know exactly what they contribute, but I can tell you that if we purposely remove something or eliminate it, we also don't know what consequences we maybe have coming down the road. So building an environment for these types of things to come back into play and start playing the role that they can play, I think is beneficial. And are we going to go through some swings and some imbalances over time? We probably will, but that's nature. Now, I always encourage people that if there's something that you don't like, if there's something that you've decided you want to hate on, you need to ask, what role does it play? Okay? Anybody hate weeds? Are weeds a problem? Are weeds the cause of a problem? What are they if they're not the cause? Some people are saying symptom under their breath. I don't want to be the one to be heard, but I would agree. Now, the thing is, if we can start identifying them, whether they're part of the root cause or whether they're a symptom, then all of a sudden it changes what our management can do. When you ask, what role does it play? That changes your whole perspective. That's like saying that no matter what information I'm going to get today, I'm going to be open and I'm going to figure out how I can make it work. I may still not do it, but I'm going to have the mindset that I can make it work. I had the opportunity to do a pasture walk in a crop walk for youth here a couple years ago, and I'd never done one with youth before. So I was excited about it, but I was a little bit hesitant because I'd always done it with, just farmers and ranchers from 20-some years old to 80-some years old. And I knew that group fairly well, but now all of a sudden I've got 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, all the way up to about 15. You want to talk about unpredictability? Turning them loose out in a big pasture? So what I did to prepare for that is I made sure I had a couple aces up my sleeve, because my biggest concern was that I would lose their attention, or I would just lose all control whatsoever. So one of the things that I went out and checked ahead of time is I turned over some cow pies, I found some dung beetles, and I thought, well, this should keep them busy for a couple minutes. Okay? The problem is we got out in the pasture and we were doing just fine, but Josh panicked. And so he played his best ace right away. I turned over a cow pie, I showed him the dung beetles, I explained the whole, what role does it play, And for the rest of the day, I wouldn't have even had to be there. Because all they did was run after cow pie after cow pie after cow pie and turned them over and looking at dung beetles. Until a little bit later that day, one of the older boys ran off. He just tore across pasture, but while he was doing it, he was stomping the whole time. He'd run and then he'd stomp, and then he'd run, he'd jump, and he would stomp. And pretty soon you heard a little squeal, and he stopped. And of course the rest of the kids are wondering what's he doing. So we go over there, and he's basically cheering himself on, and I said, "What did you do?" And he's like, "Well, I killed that mouse." And I said, "Why did you kill the mouse?" He said, "Well, all mice are bad." I said, "Why are all mice bad?" He said, "All mice have rabies." And I said, "Where did you learn that?" "I don't remember." And without missing a beat, we all get over there, and we're standing around there looking at this, well, squashed mouse. And one of these little girls say, "Before you did that, shouldn't you have asked what role does it play?" And I didn't tell her that ahead of time. I didn't bribe her with anything. But I'm like, wow. I mean, I was thinking that most of the stuff that I said during the day was, unless they could dig in cow pies, they weren't hearing anything I said. And of course, maybe when they went home that night, their parents weren't near as impressed about what they had done as I was. But the whole point was, what role does it play? Now, I'm still challenged by prairie dogs, mosquitoes, a few other things. Okay, still working on trying to find some benefits there, but I'm sure there are some. Okay, moving on to appropriate disturbance. We talked just with the machinery out there, some of the disturbance that it creates. And I'm not saying disturbance is all bad. In fact, there's some disturbances that they're actually good. Okay? But we have tools like this. We've utilized this at our demonstration farm. A few other producers are using it. We're still learning when to use it, because timing's real important when using a roller crimper like this. We're doing quite a bit of side-by-side comparisons, looking at mowing versus grazing and the biological impact that it has. Do you think it makes a difference between mechanical harvesting and harvesting with an animal? And this is where we get back to the idea that if you have the opportunity, there might be some potential to take your cropping system to another level by injecting another tool or combination of tools in there. And I know there's some that they'll probably shut the door right now, but just listen to it for a minute. In this case, in this 07 and 08 for that matter, we're pretty dry in our environment, so the yields weren't as good. But in 2007, there was a cover crop that was seeded across the entire field. Okay, a mixture of about 6 or 7 different species, a combination of mostly warm season components. That fall, they turned livestock onto half of it. The other half they chopped, okay, for silage, haylage, that sort of thing. So you can see the two different operations that took place. The following year, they planted corn with all the same operation, okay, of no-till, the same fertility across the board. And there's probably some other variables that play into this, but we have one less herbicide application based on how the animals prepared that ground. We had higher production on one versus the other. And how about the nutrients that were left in place? And that might tie directly to that production. But the point is, if we continue to take things out of the system and continue to simplify our cropping or our grazing, whichever one we're moving forward with, if we continue to simplify them, pretty soon we're going to take out a pretty critical component if we haven't already. And then is when we're going to be in big trouble. Now, we can prop up a lot of things through technology and some other tools, but we always need to keep that diversity component in mind. And in this case, it's made a big difference purely from a production standpoint. Now, I want to show you just a series of pictures on this farm on what role the livestock did play. This one here was a cover crop that was seeded and it was grazed fairly intensely. And when I say intense, I'm talking about the management of it. They didn't take all the material. Okay, if you want to put in a cover crop and you want to graze it to the ground, I can guarantee you or promise you a yield drag the next year. Because you've taken it past the point of optimum, and now you've actually gone backwards. So that little bit of extra grazing that you might have gotten to the point where a producer comes in and he says, boy, they sure like them turnip roots. Okay, we've gone well past the point of where you're going to receive those benefits. But when we manage it correctly, we end up with a nice mulch layer over the top. They went back in with corn, with a no-till planter here, just a double disc planter. This was May 2009. Now this is on Brown's Ranch again, but this is not long after the corn had just come up. Okay, and you can see what the residue looked like when they were planting into it. This is May 2009, I would say probably about the second week of May. I'd have to ask him the exact date. Here's by June 16th. Here's 2 weeks later. That year he got asked many times, I thought you were no-till. He said, I am. Well then how come you cultivated your corn? I didn't. Well, who did that? Biology. And he would tell you that this is disappearing too quickly because now he's got bare soil that's showing. And of course, by the end, by harvest season, there's nothing except for the current year's fallen leaves, few years, that sort of thing. But when we ramp up that soil biology and we get to a point where it can cycle nutrients and cycle them quick, they found out that some of the cover crop mixes, he's had to go back to cover crop mixes that are more carbon dominated and less legume dominated because it's starting to cycle so quickly because there's such a high level of biology there that's actually going against. He's done that past that point, okay, the law of diminishing returns type thing. And so all of that comes into play of the intensiveness that we use each of these tools. And of course it's tied up in the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And of course we can utilize our cover crops and grazing if we have that available to manipulate this part. This part of what we do in soil biology, especially closer to the soil surface, we can manage that. Okay, talked about recovery a little bit already and how these items, it actually, in my mind, we talk about plants, we talk about biology, we talk about the soil and the structure itself. We talk about recovery of the whole micro environment. Okay, in grazing, we're always taught that you need to watch the most severely defoliated plant in terms of recovery. I think we need to look at the most severely impacted biological item in general in that environment. And that's not always easy to decipher or determine, but I think there's more than just plants. Although plants are a good start, definitely a good start, there's other things that we can watch for. And lastly, on these 6 items, your reward. This is a farm that the Soil District purchased in 2009. And it's 10 different fields. It's about 150 acres total. But we have our tree cooler and our shop and garden and some other things, a wetland in one corner. So we have about 10 fields that are anywhere between 10 and 12 acres apiece. One of those fields we've gone to, although we're not doing the summer fallow, we're doing wheat on wheat on wheat, flax once in a while. It's no-till, but it gets full fertility, okay, full herbicide, and of course lack of rotation. That's the field on the right. We don't use cover crops in that field. We don't allow access by livestock. Everything is very, very simplified. On the left-hand side, and these 2 fields are separated by about 30 feet where these samples were taken, same minute of the same day. But we have all 4 crop types on the left-hand side, enhanced by further diversity through a cover crop mix, intensive mob grazing with sheep and with cattle, and also actually using a little bit of compost at times because we're able to utilize some of that as well. Can you see the color difference between those two? What is the color difference? What does that tell us? Organic matter, carbon, moisture retention. If you dug around a little further, you would see more root mass. You would see some similar comparison as to what's up here. This picture here was taken in 2012. 3 years. So the idea that, yeah, it'd be nice to work on this soil health thing, Josh, but if it's going to take me 15 years, I'm not interested. It doesn't take 15 years. You talk to some of these guys, one of the questions a lot of these farmers and ranchers that I work with often get asked is, how long would it take you to turn such and such a place around? Moving in the direction of soil health. And pretty consistently across the board they say 3 years. Give me 5 and I can really move it along even further. But it comes with a lot of knowledge and a lot of experiences from the past. And of course we were able to rely on a lot of that with this, and decisions not only made by the soil district, but made by board members who are all bona fide farmers and ranchers with lots of experience. A couple examples of where this might be able to go. This is an operation that over time has slowly backed off of fertility to the point now where they don't use any commercial fertilizer at all for any of their crops. And they cash crop about 3,000 acres. Somewhere right in that range, although I think they've been letting some of that go. They will tell you that they're not very good farmers, and mostly I think they say that because they like the cattle ranching, and that's kind of their bread and butter, and what their main abilities and interests are. But I think they're pretty good croppers too. Now the average and it's cut off at the bottom there, but the average corn yield in Burleigh County, dry land, is right between about 95 and 100. Okay, their established yield average is right around 130. This year was a little bit better, but they're doing this with no fertility. Now the question is, and he had someone else come and do the harvesting and use a weigh wagon so that someone else collected the numbers rather than he did. And one of the comments made by that individual is said, "Wow, that corn crop really looks good. I mean, you got higher yield than anybody else around, even this year when it was a pretty good year. But imagine if we could have put about 300 pounds of nitrogen down for you." The producer about came unglued just telling me the story because the whole point was missed. Now, to make sure that something wasn't shorted, okay, he did some tissue analysis just to find out. Okay, he was concerned, he was a little bit worried, he wanted to push the envelope, which he did to a great extent with this experiment, but he wanted to know, was I short on something to where that production could have been even better? Just with a little bit of tweaking here and there, and everything falls into the sufficient category, a couple of them even in the high category. And of course he would also then explain what his standard soil tests look like, and this would have been taken in the fall before. And of course, in the top 6 inches, he's got 9 pounds of nitrogen. In the next 6 to 24, he's got 6 pounds. And of course, then total from 0 to 24 is 15. Should that grow 160 bushel corn? 15 pounds of nitrogen? There's no way those numbers add up. There's just absolutely no way. But here's the thing. Remember the equation I talked about this morning? 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2 anymore? When we're talking about this very open, soft, natural system, there's things that can happen and can be produced that we're not necessarily always going to be able to explain or necessarily put quantitative numbers to. I'm going to jump over that one and jump to this one here. This is a soil food web analysis test. This is just one tool that we use. Okay? We use a number of different tools to try and get a handle on where we are from a fertility standpoint, a biological standpoint, and what the biology can contribute. This is, again, just one of the tools that we use. None of them are a complete tell-all. This one right here is going to show things instead of NP and K, it's going to show numbers in terms of bacterial amounts, fungal amounts, protozoa, nematodes, etc., etc. And what's probably more important is not the total numbers, but the ratios of those numbers to other ones, or communities to other communities. And the one thing that showed up here that gives us some idea is down here in the corner where that arrow is. It says 200 plus pounds of nitrogen available, slow release, over the entire season. Okay, it's not all in one shot, and I know we have some delayed release products out there now that we can take advantage of. But this is all on the biology. I shouldn't say all. There is a little bit of nitrogen available based on that soil test. But in the fall, he doesn't want high numbers of those nutrients in his soil. Okay, he wants it tied up in either biology or in the roots of a cover crop or something that's going to store it, release it the next year. These are all things that fly in the face of what I learned once upon a time and what a lot of times we operate under. And I think where we can really go somewhere is when we start looking at our current recording systems and current measurements, but consider some of these other ones, and all of a sudden we can start formulating some direction for the future. And all of a sudden, the thresholds that we thought we couldn't overcome or aren't able to overcome, all of a sudden those get erased and we can bump them up higher. And we can do more, and I think we can do more with less. This one here just compares this last one. This is percent difference between 2 different fields, and and this is just comparing the livestock versus the no livestock. So you've got no-till crop diversity plus cover crops on both, and then you've got mob grazing on one side with yearling heifers and without mob grazing on the other side. And probably a better one to look at is this right here. Their native rangeland soil organic matter, which has also probably been degraded some over the years that they're trying to build back, is one of our benchmarks that we kind of watch, and that's about 7.2 on a good portion of their native rangeland. But on this particular field, which is separated by a single row shelter belt, you have 2 years of mob grazing on cover crops on one side and just 2 years of cover crop on the other side without the livestock. You see the difference in total biology, you see the difference in bacteria, fungal component, and the ratio between the two, the mycorrhizal community. You need 2 years, and this is grid sampled across, so this isn't just, random spot over here versus random spot over there. We have 1.2% difference in organic matter. Now the long, held idea that we've had in the past is that if we want to build organic matter, we can work real hard and maybe get about 0.1% per year type thing. So you're gaining 1% in 10 years. Here we're over 1% in 2 years. So I just think there's so many things that are possible that we don't necessarily open our minds to. Now, there's all kinds of tools that we can use, and again, these guys, they constantly talk about, if I'd only known, hindsight's 20/20. If I'd only known then what I know now, there's so much quicker that they could have gotten to the point that they did. This here is just another biological test. This is on a different farm where they put a whole field of cover crop, and then the next year on half of it they put another cover crop mix, and on the other half they put corn. And of course, just putting the cover crop on the cover crop, so multiple diversity over multiple diversity versus multiple diversity and then a monoculture, right away you can see the difference in the amount of biology. And the reason that we do this is if we want to reclaim soils, if we want to boost them up, how often do we need a cover crop? And it's going to vary. Different environments, different degradation levels, things like that. So we take a look at that, and that's one of the things we're working on with our demonstration farm is every other year, every third year, every fourth year, every seventh year. We're not that far along yet, okay? But we're looking at all of those sorts of things. I've got one example to finish up with, but if you do me a big favor, would everybody stand up, please? Okay, now I just don't feel so alone anymore. No, I just found a few sleepy eyes, and of course my wife's always harping on me. She said, the attention span for most people is about 18 minutes. And then of course she goes into the whole idea of where the blood goes from up here to back here. And I said, honey, you can stop there. I don't need to know anymore. That's about all I know. And she says, so whenever you give a presentation, she said, if you talk for longer than an hour, I know you think you sound really good, but you don't sound that good. And you're not that entertaining, and I don't claim to be a comedian. So I just wanted everybody to stand up. Maybe you turn around once. You can sit right back down. I suppose I could have just walked over somewhere where the microphone squealed a whole lot, and I could have done that instead, maybe next time. Richter Farms, for those of you that had the opportunity to come to North Dakota a couple years ago, did you have the chance to go to Marlon and Pat Richter's place? Okay, it's a pretty diverse operation. We're talking about multiple generations and a couple different brothers, and everything from a dairy to a custom feedlot to cropping to a beef cow herd to custom harvesting. They've had hogs, they've got sheep. I swear honestly, another herd that runs around there is all the kids they raise. It's Richter Village. It really is, and it's a great place, wonderful people, and they've been working on soil health. They went no-till in 2001. They started putting cover crops in 2007, and they've really made a lot of strides. One of the reasons I wanted to share this one is there's some numbers. Some of the economic data, although it's simple just starting out, but I wanted to share with you some of the things that they've kept track of, because their main concern was twofold. One was in their sandy type soils, where they get that 14 to 15 inches of moisture per year, how can I use up, in the later part of the growing season, how can I use up my moisture that I am going to need for next year's crop? Okay, so why do I want to put myself at that risk? And that's why they started off small. And the other thing is, from a purely money standpoint, is this actually going to advance us, or is this going to set us back? Is this just nice in theory, or does it actually work? Well, like anything, when we start putting together a cover crop mix, we decided what their objectives were, what they wanted to accomplish, and the things that they identified that they needed more of or needed to improve. Soil armor, add some more diversity, increase their soil organic matter, work on infiltration, although in the sandy type soil it wasn't as much of an issue as in some of the heavier soils, but there were still actually some compaction layers they wanted to deal with, and then the cycling of nutrients. Some other questions that we like to ask before we move into designing a cover crop mix. And you can go to lots of places and they'll have a standard mix that they'll gladly sell you. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but you need to analyze it and know whether that is the right mix that's going to address the things that you want to achieve. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. That's the active role that we need to play as producers. But one is, what's the current crop rotation? How many crop types do you have in your rotation right now? Can you add any more of the crop types that you don't have? And based on machinery or markets or labor or timing, any of those, if you can't add them as annual crops, can you put together a cover crop mix that emphasizes that category? And therefore you can achieve feeding that nutrition that route. What is the current management methods? And in this case here, we've had quite a few conventional till producers try and do cover crops. There haven't been too many that have been successful. There's a few organic growers that instead of just putting down, just one crop of clover or something, now they're starting to put in mixes, and they're actually leaving the mixes stand. Okay, so we're utilizing some in that category. What crop is planned for the next year? Okay, you don't want to necessarily put something in that you're then going to have a struggle with taking care of the following year. All right, if you're going to plant corn the next year, or beans the next year, or wheat the next year, consider what you're putting in the cover crop this year so that it's not necessarily an issue the following year. What resources are available? Okay, you have to hire someone to do it. Can you do it yourself? Do you have someone to run the tractor, the drill, the planter, whatever it might be during that time? All those things got to come into play before you just bounce into this thing and decide, yep, we're going to do it. And what soil concerns or obstacles are you facing? Those are the ones that were on the previous slide that they wanted to address. Another real important part with cover crops is what herbicides you use. Okay, there's some of them that, based on some of the residual effect that they have, there's some cover crop species, if you follow that herbicide application, or if that was used with the previous crop, there's some of them that don't do real well. Our wheat crop, a lot of times has the herbicide wide match used. Turnips and radishes come up about this far, and then they're done. Okay? A little bit of trial and error that we found before we figured that one out. But there's some different things you just got to coordinate through this process. The other thing is the timing part of it. For years and years when we first started, we would find where are our windows in the growing season that we can grow a cover crop. And of course for us, we had to look at like our winter wheat, our winter triticale, our peas, maybe barley, some of those things. And of course, the only way to have those options is if you have some of those things in the rotation in the first place. For our situation then, we would find something that was early harvested that we could then come in with a cover crop behind it and have a certain amount of growing season that we could still grow something. Now, like I told you before, it's a little hit and miss depending on how dry it was, but as we build that soil health, it gets to be less and less a risk to put it there. Dave and Ken and those guys, they would tell you that you might as well put it in the ground because it sure isn't going to grow in the bin. But their soil health levels are up quite a bit, and they can take that risk. And I think a lot more people can too, because you got to start somewhere. The other thing that we've moved to, if somebody's in a really degraded situation or really wants to boost fertility, infiltration, the water cycle, the mineral cycle in general, is we will help them take a smaller area, maybe even 10 or 20 acres, and we will do a full season cover crop mix with them. Now here, with probably a longer growing season than we have, you might be able to get what's equivalent to a full season cover crop and still utilize one of your annual crops. I'm not sure. Probably would depend on what you would use. But the point is that in our environment, we had a much better chance of getting that cover crop mix established if we seeded it in the spring when we have more reliable moisture, letting it grow all season, and then utilizing it either by chopping it, haying it, and more preferably by grazing it. And a lot of times in the later part of the year when the pastures are starting to go downhill some from a nutrition standpoint, we've got some of these that are really coming on in the fall of the year. And boy, I tell you, it works awful good to be able to graze those, preparing to go into winter that way, rather than having to start baling it up and feeding it by bales. Here's one of the tools that we use. Okay, it's just a simple spreadsheet where we identify what those resource concerns are. This is the Dome Ranch, which some of you may have heard about. On the top are all of those soil resource concerns and or objectives that they're trying to achieve. Vertical structure, and in this case here we're talking about above ground vertical structure because they have a wildlife enterprise in addition to cropping, cow-calf pairs, contract grazing, agritourism. I mean, they've got a lot going on in this place, but vertical structure for wildlife habitat was one. Legume for fertility for the crop the next year. Nitrogen scavenger for the nutrients that they think they bleach below what's going to be the root zone of most of these crops that they want to grow. Wildlife food is one. Pollinators to build that habitat for insects was another part. They wanted carbon because they know they've lost a lot of carbon over the years. They want to build that back. You need higher carbon, or at least medium type carbon plants. And of course, deep rooted in order to work on infiltration. So you see, they can work on, what do they have here? 7 different items at the same time. This is that multifaceted tool. And then they throw grazing on top of this, plus it facilitates their hunting and guiding enterprise. It's all multi-dimensional in this whole process. And of course, soil health is the reason they're working on this in the first place. Then we start identifying species that fit these categories. And better yet, we like to identify species that can fit more than one category. Keeps our costs down lower. It allows us to address more things with more species at the same time. And it just adds overall diversity to the system. Now this is the mix that Richter's actually put in. Now of the 4 crop types, what's the one crop type you don't see? I'm hearing cool season grass. Why do you think we didn't put cool season grass in that mix? That's the cash crop. But based on their soils, limited moisture, sandy soils, risk, all of those things, they've raised a lot of spring wheat, barley, oats, okay, small grains like that over the years. That soil has had that year after year after year. This year it had peas, so we injected that legume into the mix. That gave us a window of time after the peas. They seeded this mix here the first week in July. I think it was right after the 4th of July actually is when they seeded this. And of course they emphasized all of the things that they wanted to address. And of course, from a nutritional standpoint, they emphasize the things that they weren't providing through their annual rotation. A variety of equipment, and I'm not going to spend any time on here because we did that before lunch. We've got, guys that have real simple units. We have others that have pretty dynamic type units. And all of them are able to seed cover crop mixes with them. Some throw it all in one box and they go. Others have lots of tanks, compartments, variable rate type items that they can utilize to do a lot of their calibrating and seeding in that mode rather than having to calibrate on the ground, mix it into a small drill, and just go. I showed you this picture. These are a couple of the different simple mixes. We've done corn and cowpea together. We've done corn and soybean actually together, interrow. We've done barley and red clover, seeded all at the same time. Red clover acts like a biennial in our environment. So it actually we can take the barley off, the red clover comes back, and so we've actually got a cover crop seeded from the onset rather than having to come back in and seed something else. This is on Richter's right here where it's a 7-way mix. This is about the 1st of October. Like I said, they utilize some of these species, such as a radish, to work on some of those restrictive layers that were created over time from compaction, from plow layers, those sorts of things. You can see what this radish had to fight through, but it also did its job. Okay, it worked at it until it got through. Now you puncture a whole bunch of those biological streets and avenues through there. What do you think that does for oxygen and infiltration of water? It starts flowing faster and faster and better and better. And if you're building your organic matter at the same time, all of a sudden you're starting to get that cycle wound up to really, really work for you. Building soil structure at the same time with that continual live root in the ground as much as possible. Those peas came off. I believe it was the 5th of July. This cover crop mix went in the 7th of July. Very little time in between. Okay? If we can get that down even tighter, maybe we can get to a point through technology and equipment that we can get it on sooner. Maybe if there's aerial application that works in your area. It's been hit and miss with ours. We're going to continue to work on it. If there is the need, there is the knowledge and the ability for someone to develop the products that we need to be able to do this. If there is a market for it, I guarantee you someone will come up with the product or the technology to make it work. But until we show a need for that, and I think there is a need for it, it's going to be harder and more available, or not as available as we would maybe like it to be. Legumes in there, fixing nitrogen. I talked about organic matter, but in order to do that, we need to have roots in the soil to be able to accomplish that. When you put radishes down in the soil like this, it really opens it up. And we're talking about, especially our full season mixes, 4, 5, 6 feet down, you will get roots. And they won't stay this big all the way down by any means, but they will slowly work their way down. When we dig soil pits and look at roots, it's really quite amazing to see what those roots sometimes do on their way down, but just how hard they'll work for us if given the chance. The Richters talk about it as a dual feeding system, okay? And I talked about this earlier, cash grain farmers, you have livestock too, okay? They're just below ground. Here's the water situation. Why on earth would we want to use up my water this year that I'm going to need next year? Well, I told you that they planted peas. Took the peas off, put the cover crop on. And with that worry, lo and behold, that winter we went through the driest 6 months ever recorded near Bismarck. Okay? It was setting up kind of like the perfect storm. Of course, us at the soil district that really encouraged this, we were starting to really question whether we should have opened our mouths. But what we did to try and satisfy that is they went in and before they planted corn, we got the NRCS soil scientists to come out and core the field that had cover crop, the field that had just manure, and the field that didn't have either one of those treatments. And the comparison between the non-cover crop field and the cover crop field in the top 4 feet, 0.04 of an inch difference in moisture content. To me, that's negligible. So what happened? That crop had to use more than 0.04 of an inch moisture, didn't it? How much residue is left on a field after you raise peas? And you chop them? Hardly anything. Guess what tried to establish itself on that field? Weeds. Guess what the tool of choice is to try and make sure that doesn't happen? Okay? And spray it with a herbicide. We actually had to do that twice. What is the water cycle doing on the side where we basically have rock hard soil, a few weeds, and no residue? It's almost like this one over here on the far side. On the other side, we do have an active crop growing, okay, this mixture. But the ground's shaded, the ground's covered. We're working on all of these different objectives all at the same time, and I would suggest that the water cycle is actually functioning fairly well, or at least we're improving it as we move forward. We're not leaving this bare and hard like on the non-cover crop side. A couple other side benefits just to close here. The cover crop side over here on the left versus non-cover crop side on the right. They eliminated a herbicide application in the spring before they planted corn. On the cover crop side, they just went in and planted corn. They planted into residue like that, which was fairly thick, but like I said, it was with the right equipment, and I think he just runs a John Deere planter. You can see him just in the background here, but Marlon seeded that day, and he was actually pretty excited. You want to know why he was excited? Because across the road on his neighbors, this is supposed to be a ditch. You see this little spear, and I know it's really hard to see, but that little spear right there, there's about 10 to 12 inches showing. That's a steel fence post that normally stands this tall. How much value do you think was lost into that ditch in terms of topsoil? And is he going to get that topsoil back? Now someone else is going to inherit it somewhere. Okay? Probably not someplace where they're going to be able to utilize it though. Richter's soil didn't go anywhere that day, and we had some pretty hellacious winds, I remember, in the spring of 08, because it just blew day and night, week after week after week. So residue played a big role that year. Okay, the economics, and then I promise that I'm done. In 2007, okay, we had those 3 different treatments. All right, we had on the north field it was cover crop, no manure. In the middle field it was no cover crop but with manure, and on the south end it was no cover crop, no manure. Prior to the cover crop being seeded, each one got 1 herbicide application. Okay, and for all of these rates at that time, they charged themselves the custom rate, even though they did it themselves. They charged themselves a custom rate because that's what they thought was fair for comparison standpoint. The non-cover crop with manure, both the middle and the south both required a second herbicide application. I told you about the weeds that came and that they had what they had to do to take care of that. Okay? Now if we look at yield, weight, moisture. Right away, if you jump over here and look at yield, which one did the best? No cover crop, but with manure. Huh? Cover crops don't work, do they? If you limit yourself to just this information and don't look at the rest of the picture, you're going to miss out on some opportunity. And it was really good that we got to work through this as a team, because we looked at all of these different categories, okay, and what it produced, and tried to figure out why. Because now if you put together all of this here is the bushels times the cash price at the time, and what the gross income was, and of course that middle field, non-cover crop, turns out to be the most gross income. But if you start taking away for the cover crop side, the expenses and that sort of thing, it changes the picture some. Okay? Now there's cover crop expenses that go into it, plus the cost of seeding and the rate of the seed and the seeding itself. But they also grazed it, and they netted an extra $66 from grazing it. And I'm not adding that in here. Okay, so the picture just keeps getting a little bigger, little bigger, little bigger, and a lot of times we tend to look at production levels and make some decisions based on those, and that, just like any other tool, is just one part of that particular equation. Now, this year, the only thing they don't like about this data is, like I said, 08 was pretty dry, continued to be pretty dry, so you're looking at yields of what was it, 80-some bushels per acre, 70-some in the other one. They say, don't go showing that to the wrong crowd. Last year, were you guys pretty dry? What was the corn yield average in the area?
The southern part of my county was 50 bushels an acre.
Okay.
That should be producing 150 to 190 bushels.
Okay. All right. So a quarter to a third of what it normally would be.
Soybeans was running 15 or 20 bushels.
Okay. And the reason I ask that is not to compare this versus here, but just to look at it from a relative standpoint or a percentage standpoint. This here, average yield in the county, like I was telling you, was 95 to 100, and they feel bad because they got mid-80s. Can mid-80s work relative to what our average is? It's a little on the lower side, but we can handle that. The more we build up those soils, the more we're going to be able to get through years like that. And then, like in 2011 on the Browns place, the more we can really swing for the fences on years that turn out to be quite a bit better. Okay? But it's taking out those peaks and valleys that we a lot of times have in agriculture and trying to level that playing field a little bit and buffer ourselves from those particular extremes. Okay, this goes through some of the fertility that they used, and this was applied in all three applications. And of course, the plant population for us or for them, and they've bumped this now to about 22,000 or so, but they were at 19 at the time. And then, of course, what the manure application was, and that came from their beef feedlot and from their dairy operation. That's what they applied. And all of those costs go in based on, and this one actually includes the seeding, all of those that would be applied in which situations respectively. And then, of course, what the net income is. Now, currently, that net income is going to be quite a bit higher. The prices are higher. But the point is if you can achieve those production levels, but your expenses don't have to go up proportionally because your soil's taking over and it's allowing you to go further and further with less and less, then there's just more return to that operation each and every time while building the soil in the process. And it's kind of a delicate balance when you start. Okay, there's a transition period that's probably the hardest of any of it. You transition to no-till, you transition to cover crops, you transition to utilizing livestock appropriately on cropland. All of those things have to be managed appropriately. And the value of improved soil health, in my mind, then, is something that's pretty priceless. Now, I know money drives so many things, but if you have patience and you're willing to work at this, the profitability part of this, it comes. And especially if you want to continue to push the limits, if it's appropriate to push the limits in the first place, but if you do, you're going to need your soils to be able to accomplish that. And like I said earlier, it's not going to be a moisture or a nitrogen or a phosphorus limiting type deal. It's going to be the health and function of that soil to be able to take nutrients, transfer them to the plant to actually produce what you really want to produce. And if you're lucky, maybe you can grow some turnips like we do in North Dakota. That's it. I tried to get through that as quick as I could. So I can take questions now, or I can sure wait till later. Okay, thank you very much.